Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Impact of Sense of Belonging in College author webinar. My name's David Brightman. I'm a senior editor with Stylus Publishing. Stylus webinars bring you direct access to our authors and to hear about their latest titles. Today, I'm happy to introduce Erin Bentrim and Gavin Henning, co-editors of the forthcoming title, The Impact of a Sense of Belonging in College, Implications for Student Persistence, Retention, and Success. The book is due out in August, and later I'll be giving you information about how you can pre-order. Joining Erin and Gavin today will be chapter authors Michael Williams, Dianne Timm, Terrell Strayhorn, Sherry Woosley, Burt Ellison, and Annemarie Vaccaro. The sense of belonging is a construct distinct from involvement and engagement and is experienced differently by college students based on their multiple and intersecting identities. But similar to involvement and engagement, there are benefits of experiencing sense of belonging in college for student success, including persistence and completion. In this webinar, our panelists offer a preview, an overview of the book, I'm sorry, not a preview, an overview of the book, discuss the differential impact of sense of belonging, and answer your questions using Zoom chat and Q&A functions. Welcome to all of our panelists today. Folks, take it away. I'll see you back at the end.
Thank you so much, David, and thanks to Stylus for allowing us some time to talk about a topic that I know has been on my mind for a while. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for being here. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about the how this book came to be. And I want to give us some environmental context around why we decided to write this book. And I'm going to start off with thinking about, we're talking about some data points of which you are probably aware, but will give us some context. So data points related to birth rates in the United States, college enrollment trends, and retention, persistence, and graduation rates. So if you think about birth rates, they were already at an all-time low before the pandemic. There was some anticipation that there would be a baby boom arising from the pandemic, but provisional data is showing us that birth rates actually dropped by 4%. As far as undergraduate enrollment, between 2003 and 2017, undergraduate enrollment increased by 17%. Now, projections from 2017 to 2028, projections show an increase of only 2%. So you'll see that's a gap there. And also these projections were reported in 2017, which was 5 years ago, and we're in a very different world now. So now that we're thinking about birth rates, decreasing enrollments, talking a little bit about student success, 30% of students, college students, drop out before their sophomore year, and 62% drop out before they graduate in 6 years. So those numbers are kind of a little frightening as higher ed administrators, faculty, staff. So when you think about these things in this context, it's really no wonder that colleges and universities have begun to frame discussions around student success in new ways. Some of the historical approaches are not working, and we need to really think about what we're going to do next. So Gavin and I had noticed that on both of our campuses, discussions were taking place around sense of belonging as a concept that could positively impact student success. But there seemed to be a lack of agreement on how to define sense of belonging, how to measure it, what tools to use, and the limited research that's out there investigating sense of belonging is kind of scattered around in different literature. So Gavin and I chatted, and on our own, but together, we extensively researched sense of belonging and determined that this book would be a worthwhile publication. So our intention and vision was to bring together all of the research into one volume and address what sense of belonging is, what it looks like, and how it impacts student success. We put out a call for authors in April of 2020, which was approximately 1 month after the pandemic started. And we were a little unsure of what that would mean for this book. Fortunately, we were overwhelmed with the number of submissions and so pleased with the quality of the authors who agreed to join us. And I'm delighted to say that this book has become an even more valuable tool for us as educators, as we've had to shift to new teaching modalities and students have not been on campus. So that gives you a little bit of context around why we went in this direction. And I'll let Gavin talk a little bit about the organization of the book.
First of all, I want to echo what Erin said about the authors. I was amazed at the folks who chose to submit proposals, and you can see some of the big names on our screen right now, and people have been doing research in this area. This is actually a topic for a couple of my doctoral students, and they really struggled to really pull together the research that was in a lot of places. So our goal was to really try to pull all of that content into one place, so it's a little bit easier to access all of that. And so we've really structured the book into 3 sections. The first section is theories and foundations. And we actually have 3 of the chapter authors from the 3 chapters in this section who will talk a little bit about those chapters. So that provides a foundation of what the literature is, what the scholarship is. Terrell will talk a little bit about this distinction between engagement, involvement, and belonging. And then Bert and his co-author, John Braxton, talk a little bit about this connection to persistence. And so it really provides that strong foundation. Then the next section is really, what does sense of belonging look like for different student populations? Because when Erin and I were doing the research, we realized it looked different for different groups of students. And that's really important. And Annemarie and Barbara Newman get into this a little bit in their first chapter on the theoretical foundations, but we have a lot of different folks talking about what it looks like for different populations. But there's also some commonalities in there that are brought up. And then the final section are implications and applications. So there's some mini case studies about what people are doing on their campuses to foster a sense of belonging. We have some other topics related to social media and the impact on that. We also have Sherry and Dianne talking about their chapter around some survey data, which is really helpful to get a sense of that. And then there's a chapter about what tools do you use? Because one of my doc students, like, I'm having trouble finding tools to measure this. And so we've got a fantastic chapter that really talks about all of those different tools available and gives a little background and some pros and cons of each of those. So you can check out the table of contents on the Stylus webpage. We'll drop that link into the chat in a moment. But really, we want to focus on our chapter authors because they're really the key elements of here. Erin and I are just kind of the facilitators. And so first, we're going to go in kind of order in the way that it comes in the book. We'll start with Annemarie. She'll give a brief overview of her chapter, followed by Terrell, Bert, and then Michael, and then we'll wrap up with Sherry and Dianne. So let's pass it over to Annemarie.
Thank you very much. And thanks for inviting me. I'm honored to be included today and really excited that there are 130 attendees here with us today. And I'm here on behalf of my co-author, Dr. Barbara Newman, who couldn't be here today. So I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about our chapter, and I look forward to some conversation with participants. So like many of you, I work on a campus, and I think I actually see some folks from my campus in the attendee list, where our university is talking a lot about belonging. We are tossing the word around. We know that it's important. People have in senior positions and faculty positions have read the literature about how important belonging is for really important developmental and academic outcomes for college students. And they're really, really interested in fostering belonging. And many of you might be from campuses where folks want to do that, but they want the really simplistic magic solution. And I think one of the reasons why Dr. Newman and I decided to write this chapter is because we really want to push back against that and complicate this idea. And our earlier work was really informed by Dr. Terrell Strayhorn's work, who early on really kind of showed us that belonging does look different for different populations. And so it really informed how we approach the work. And so that's what our chapter is kind of 2 parts. So the first part is just sharing our own scholarship in kind of a summative form. We did a study on the sense of belonging where we actually didn't start with a definition of belonging. We asked our participants, how do you define belonging? What does it mean for you? What are some of the things that foster or inhibit the belonging definition that you just gave us? We found some really interesting things, and we found some commonalities across our student population. We interviewed 50 undergraduate students at one institution, and we saw some patterns in the similar things that they said, but we also saw some really interesting patterns by subgroups of students. And so we published papers, and in this chapter, we do a summary of the work that we have about how privileged and minoritized students responded to our prompts and talked about belonging and the things that fostered or inhibited their belonging. Then we also kind of did a deep dive into some of those subpopulations. So students with disabilities had really different and interesting narratives about what belonging looked and felt like and how it was fostered for them. We have a paper on first generation women of color who talked about kind of their families and their families of origin is really important to their sense of belonging on campus. And then lesbian, gay, bisexual, and pansexual students who talked a lot about this notion of belonging being kind of micro and macro. What the university says about who I am and who's welcome here matters to me, even if I don't use those services in our LGBTQ center. So we were just fascinated by the stories that students told and honored to be able to share them in publications, and then really excited when Gavin and Erin were interested in having us kind of summarize some of that work in a holistic way, because those of you who are authors or who are aspiring to be authors, sometimes we have to chop our work up into manuscripts that are 20 to 25 pages, and that feels really it doesn't quite feel right? It's not a holistic way to really talk about kind of what your data say. So this chapter was our opportunity to bring those pieces all together in a summative way. But then my colleague, Barbara Newman, who's an expert in the field of human development and family studies, said, I also want to build on the work that's come before us and really honor the history of some of these concepts. So the concept of belonging, but some of the very similar concepts that really fed into the development of the notion of belonging in lots of different fields, from social science to psychology to positive psychology to human development. And so we then provide in the second half of our chapter kind of a brief overview of some of that literature. It's a very brief overview, but it gives you a sense of where some of these concepts have come from. So we have a section on evolutionary theory. We have a section on social cognitive neuroscience. And then we have a section on psychosocial development. And we cite some of the kind of seminal studies in those areas that really help us understand this kind of robust notion of belonging. And so in sum, we're really honored to be part of this book because it really honors and attends to kind of the nuance of belonging from varied perspectives. And I'm so excited to read the rest of the book as an author myself, because I think that it's a really great tool, I think, for campuses to use to push back against administrators or those of us who are, I'm an administrator now, those of us who are administrators who want the simple, easy solution to fostering belonging for students, because there isn't a simple, easy solution, but there's really incredible research that's being done by all the authors in this book and all the folks that we've cited about how to really foster belonging for lots of different populations on our campuses. So thanks for having me, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Annemarie. And Annemarie alluded to another great resource in the book, is the content is amazing. It really is. But look at the reference list. There is a lot of great stuff in there, the history of sense of belonging and some of those adjacent topics. So if you're interested in any research, obviously the content's great, but take a look at those reference lists for the chapters as well. And next, Terrell, and we were really excited that Terrell was willing to join this, because we would not be having this conversation without Terrell's work. Terrell really brought this topic to higher education. And we were amazed that he agreed to participate and bring his knowledge and his expertise to this. So we'll actually pass it over to Terrell to talk a little bit about this connection between engagement, involvement, and sense of belonging. How are they separate, different? Because this chapter really provides that foundational piece.
Thank you very much, Gavin and Erin. Thank you both for the opportunity to contribute to a worthy volume that adds to, I think, the ever-expanding shelf of knowledge about sense of belonging. And so to all of my fellow co-authors or authors of the book, excited to be on this panel with you and those who are in the audience as well. So as was mentioned, sense of belonging is this concept that has picked up in popularity and frequency I think also in its substantiveness, however, in the field of higher education, where, as Annemarie and others have mentioned, there are a lot of presidents, provosts, board members who can get behind this idea that part of what we have to do as institutions is ensure that our students feel a sense of belonging. And the evidence base, some of which other chapter authors will talk about, the evidence base is pretty clear that when students feel a sense of belonging, they're engaged in their own learning. They, go to class, so class attendance goes up, their grades are elevated, their retention rates tend to be higher, graduation rates tend to be higher. And even those who study philanthropy and alumni giving have found that students who report satisfaction with their experience in college, feel like they mattered and people cared about them, are more generous givers and contributing members as alumni. So as I've been talking about, I mean, you've got engagement in learning, you've got students being involved in their undergraduate and graduate experience, you've got all these outcomes around retention and graduation rates. And so I was excited to have the opportunity to, again, put some thoughts on paper about how these concepts come together. So in short, I framed the chapter around this all too important issue of college student success, because that's what we all know to be important in higher education. Students come to my institution, your institution. Why? Because they want to be successful. Yet we know and have known for decades that half of the students who enter higher education either don't finish in a 4 to 6 year period, take much longer in accruing debt, or somehow some other reason drop out. So there's several reasons why students either stay and succeed or drop out. One that I think really connects well with Annemarie's point is there's a long, expansive literature in higher ed around support. And all students need support, not just those who are not academically prepared, not just those who are from urban or rural neighborhoods. All students need support. It's just what type of support they need may be different. And so I argue this in the chapter that, pointing to academic support, social support, financial support, emotional support, and the fact that all students need it. Social support and academic support have shown up to be really important factors in this formula for student success and student adjustment to college. And the research has distinguished between structural and functional forms of support. So structural really refers to the accessibility and availability of supports that institutions provide. While functional support is not that we just provide counseling and we provide academic advising, but the student actually finds it functional, actually finds it useful and effective for their success. And so after that point, I then turn to the research that says, it's essential for students to establish relationships with faculty and staff, especially those who are, deeply engaged in the academic and social life of college, student affairs professionals and the like. And so then I posit that there's this equity imperative that is, we've known for years that institutions have a responsibility to formulate programs and policies that will facilitate students being engaged with faculty, right? So I then say that that's an equity imperative because we know that not all students naturally get those connections. And we also know that, left to our own devices, even well-intended faculty, staff, student affairs professionals pick and choose. And if they don't pick and choose, you end up, as a chief academic officer, I saw those who are high achieving and then those who are on the opposite end of that spectrum. But I rarely, unless I was more intentional about it, saw those who live in the murky middle, the magic middle, I don't know which one to call it, but it's a whole lot of people in that space that we miss. And so I argue then that institutions have this opportunity to formulate policies and programs to ensure that all students get that kind of experience. Positive relationships, frequent interactions, meaningful, functional interactions with the services we provide. So then I have now laced in the chapter the terms that I have also listened to the chapter of the terms that our colleague Lisa Wolf-Wendell in a 2009 publication called The Tangled Web of Terms, engagement, involvement, and terms like sense of belonging. And so I say again, I actually try not to do this too much, but I did direct quote myself because this is my opinion on this matter. I agree that there are important nuances to these terms and definitions. They are not the same. That is not my opinion. But since I only have 5 minutes and there's like a minute and a half left, I'm not going to split hairs about these three terms. If you want to tell me that some part of engagement is related to involvement, I probably will agree with you, but I also address that this conceptual confusion or this construct conflation that I've observed in the literature around sense of belonging really results from diminishing details, much like Annemarie said. When you have to cut your ideas down to 25 pages or 10 pages, a lot gets left on the cutting room floor. And before you know it, we start talking about engagement like it's involvement. And like Aston said something about sense of belonging. And this is just false.com, not true. So I talk about this in the chapter. I point to the root of these terms. I highlight the definitions that have been populated or popularly cited in the literature. And then I offer a critical perspective, and that is, look, engagement, involvement, sense of belonging are related, but not the same. There's also another important point that Gavin and Erin gave me space in the book to talk about, and that is that it's not that engagement in anything will produce everything, or involvement in any club or organization for any students. So this I saw in the question in the chat about when. Yes, we addressed the question of when and why and how and under what conditions. And I think that I argue that's a critical perspective that pays attention to how power and privilege points at certain experiences. This is no critique of the people who have done this work, because they're good colleagues and scholar friends of mine, but there's this whole literature on high impact practices that tend to elevate experiences like studying abroad, yet we've known that 10% of students of color ever participate in that. It also depends on you having disposable income to where you can study abroad. And so I point to other experiences that seem potent with fostering global perspectives, fostering intercultural communication and the like. And then I close with clarifying the tangled web of terms gives us the power to put theory into practice and to really put our words to work. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Terrell. We did have a quick question, just to clarify, what are the 4 supports again? Academic, financial, social, and what was the 4th one?
Emotional?
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, well, we're going to pass it over to Bert to talk a little bit about the impact of sense of belonging on persistence.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Erin and Gavin, first for facilitating this opportunity along with the other panelists, and also on behalf of my co-author, John Braxton out of Vanderbilt. I'm really grateful to be involved with this important project. So again, everyone, my name is Burt Ellison, and I'm a graduate of the City, Culture, and Community program at Tulane University, where I earned my PhD in sociology, studying the development of college students' sense of belonging, particularly during the first year of undergraduate enrollment. I'm currently housed in the Office of Academic Advising at Wake Forest University, and I work with a lot of academic STEM departments and STEM students, fostering belonging in those various fields on the academic side. So when John Braxton and I were formulating this chapter and working with Gavin and Erin, we really wanted to introduce sense of belonging as a formal variable of inquiry in theories of student persistence. Not that it hasn't been talked about, but the fun part about theory, I think, is it can be particularly creative, but it also requires humility, because we could be totally wrong. And so it's just this really fun space to put together concepts, to put those concepts in conversation with literature, and to see what happens. And so I hope that our chapter is part of an ongoing conversation about the role of sense of belonging in theories of students' persistence. But to go down that path, we discussed the historic development of college students' sense of belonging, kind of from its psychological roots to what I'm calling its sociological branches. And we reviewed relevant literature in that vein. We came up with a working definition of the concept. And then we used some of Dr. Braxton's work in a text he came up with some colleagues in 2014, I believe, where we inserted sense of belonging into a theory of persistence in commuter colleges. And I've seen some of those questions in the chat, and also into a theory of residential colleges and institutions. So wanted to kind of make that bifurcation, knowing that of all the voices that have been said, sense of belonging manifests differently for various student populations, but it's also a function of the spaces that those students are in and institutional factors. So we wanted to think about that. So briefly, I had 3 takeaways I wanted to share with everyone today. First is why John Braxton and I think sense of belonging is an important topic in higher ed. And basically, without students, universities cease to exist, right? The student is the center of many of the activities of faculty, professional staff, leaders, and sense of belonging is one of those primary student-centered concepts. And sense of belonging focuses us on those factors that empower students to develop community across a wide variety of campus domains. And that's where part of my research has come in, is how do students develop sense of belonging in these discrete yet overlapping domains on a college campus. And what sense of belonging reminds us is that students exist in relationship with these various communities within higher education, and that these various communities have a responsibility, I would argue, to extend invitation belongings to their members. So that's number one. The broader impact of sense of belonging on students related specifically to retention, to persistence, to student success. Well, it is clear that the students don't have to have a sense of belonging in order to succeed in college. You might have been one of those students, you might know those in your world, but it sure does help, right? We do know that students with a strong sense of belonging are more likely to intend to persist, to actually persist, and also to perform better academically, to connect more fully with their peers, with their professors, and they're even more likely to be in better health relative to their peers. So in a sense, many things fall into place after a student belongs. And then finally, one of the big takeaways is that I hope that readers will take away a greater appreciation for the role that sense of belonging may play in theories of student persistence, both in commuter colleges and residential institutions. But really couched within that appreciation, my hope is that readers will think critically about how a sense of belonging manifests uniquely among various student populations and in various higher ed contexts. Most importantly, I think we can all benefit from reflecting and acting upon ways in which we can help create environments in which all students may feel a sense of belonging. So again, thanks for having me, and I look forward to any questions that brings up.
Great, thanks, Bert. Again, feel free to drop questions into the chat, and just general questions or specific to any of our panelists. Next, we'll go over to Michael Williams. So talk a little bit about his chapter that he co-authored that takes a look at gender and delves into intersectionality. So Michael.
Hi, everybody. It's exciting. So I'll probably take a little bit different tack than some of the other panelists because I think some of the work that Erin was talking about in terms of the larger context of what was going on when the initial call for chapters came out was particularly interesting for me, and it led to the way that we approached the chapter. And so thinking about belonging, intersectionality, like some of the general core ideas, because I see sense of belonging as a theoretical framework into and unto itself. Not only because I was blessed to do my doctoral work under Dr. Terrell Strayhorn, shout out big homie, but also because as you start to think about the ways that engagement, inclusion, involvement, and even the terminology that a lot of universities are using right now to bridge some of these gaps and to push towards retention and like student success, I think you have to circle back and kind of look at the foundations over again. And some of the political unrest and the feelings, almost like the forced disconnection going on in society because of the pandemic, because of the racial unrest in larger society, because of the events of January 6th. Those were some of the ideas that we were kind of wrestling with. And what it led to was this focus on gender and belonging together. And what I found, I was always kind of taught, and I teach my doctoral students, theory are glasses that you put on to look at your data. They're glasses that you put on to look at the world. And I've always been excited about blending theories and thinking about like, all right, how do we see belonging differently if we put it up against critical race theory, if we put it up against Black feminist thought. And in the case of this chapter, what we really focused on was this idea of intersectionality. We conceptualized, so I was working on the chapter with one of my doctoral students, the future Dr. Kaite Udo. She was making progress in defending her comprehensive exams this semester, so that's exciting. But one of the things that we were paying particular attention to in that intersectionality, and this is intersectionality as conceptualized by Kimberly Crenshaw, like her 1989 work. And when you look at structural, representational, and political intersectionality, and then you put it up against belonging in the college context, it kind of forces you to think differently about some things that we spend a lot of time on, but we don't ever necessarily like critically consider. And so for me, it was in the midst of some other work on Black women's experiences in college, on sense of belonging through diversity and equity initiatives. And it was pretty revelatory to see that at no reasonable point were we able, and this was also like part of some other writing work, a policy brief on the experiences of women of color in colleges and universities in the country, that some of the strides that have been made in terms of the support of Black male initiatives and Black male leadership programs, that hadn't translated in a meaningful way to Black women. And when you're in the social political climate that we still find ourselves in, I mean, Trump is about to get restored to Twitter. There are plenty of open loops that relate to like belonging and really bridging the chasm between the espoused and enacted values, not only of institutions of higher education, but for students who were kind of made some promises. When we start to change the terminology and we put in titles like, you know, one of my faculty colleagues is now in an administrator role, and belonging is part of the title, you know, like the director of belonging. You know, who's being recognized, who's being seen, and what isn't. And so we use Dr. Strayhorn's framework for belonging. I like it because it pays particular attention to mattering and how those are conceptually different, but also that people can pursue belonging in positive and not so positive ways. And we put that up against this idea of intersectionality to look at the differences in the ways that Black men and Black women are treated in post-secondary education contexts. And one of the things that we came away with was really this idea of silencing, like how does it happen? So if you arrive at a campus and they have a large Black male initiative program and they have alumni and they're sharing the images of it, of successful graduates and people who participate, what kind of messages is that sending to Black women? That similar programs, similar resources, similar ideas about the importance of their success aren't being backed up with resource allocation. And really troubling that and thinking through it, both in terms of how we think about diversity initiatives, but also how we think about inclusion in general. I'm a firm believer that the concepts of inclusion and diversity and belonging are all really deeply intertwined with each other, and that you can't really push on any of them individually, like it kind of has to be collectively pushed for. And so when I think about belonging and inclusion in particular, there's the navigation of the kind of implicit messages about whether you belong somewhere. So are there services? Is there a cultural center? Are there professors that look like me? A lot of the symbolic things that we don't necessarily trouble and question, but also some of the larger, like more direct messages that might be sent to students about like whether and how they need help by the provision of services that are available at an institution. And so I like that Gavin and Erin were really tight with us in terms of word count for the chapter, because it could have been going on forever about like what to see and what not to see. But I think one of the critical takeaways for us is the necessity of not only researchers, but administrators, anybody that's involved in resource allocation, anybody that's involved in the really broad and fluctuating notions of student success. So like, of course, the institutional notions of student success that we care about in terms of the metrics. Are people graduating on time? Are they making progress to degree in reasonable time? But also, as we think of more holistic thoughts about what student success means, are people becoming the type of person that they want to be? Are they able to enter society in the global job market in the place that they want? That we need to revisit and continue to re-examine what we're saying, both implicitly and explicitly, about like who should belong and what success really means. And to me, it's exciting because there's so much more work to do. I really saw this as almost an exciting like opening intellectual exercise. And I think it also calls specifically methodologically to the fact that we need more information especially on the qualitative side of things, about like the precursors to a sense of belonging. You know, like, how do we develop it? How do we get people to like feel it? And then how do we get them to stay there, right? Like, what are the instances? What are the methods? What are the interventions? What are the ways that we can kind of continually revisit to make sure that people do feel that sense of connection, that sense of viability, that sense that like people care about them and want them in their spaces, especially on college campuses, whether they show up as students, staff, faculty, or any type of administrator.
Great, thanks, Michael. And to wrap us up for the chapter authors, we have Sherry Woosley, Dianne Timm talking about the impact of sense of belonging and how COVID affected that. So as Erin mentioned, the call for authors came out right at the beginning of that. And clearly there was an impact on COVID and everything that went along with that on sense of belonging. So they'll talk a little bit about their research. So I'll pass it over to Sherry and Dianne.
I think I'll start, and Dianne, you can jump in. I'm Sherry Woosley, and again, thank you, Erin and Gavin. And I think Dianne and I, maybe I'll speak for you, if that's okay. We're both a little stunned that we ended up in this book, given who else is on this panel and on the list of things. I feel kind of like we stumbled into this because the call came out in April, and in March was when we saw campuses started to shut down. And I worked for Macmillan, and we wondered what we could do to help all of our campus colleagues. I come off a campus, and we were talking to some friends at Pharos Resources who does relational retention and is really focused on campuses. And we decided to offer a free survey to help campuses talk to students at these times of closure. And it sounded like such a great idea in March when we all thought it was a 2 or 3 week closure. And, you know, just to take you back 2 years ago, right? And the survey ended up going out at 39 institutions between late March and June. And 14,000, actually it was closer to 15, 16,000 students responded to it. And 14,000 students answered a question about what they missed most by not being on campus. And so that was the question. It wasn't actually really a belonging question. It was, I have to kind of, I guess, carry on some of the messages that have been said. It was primarily for your campuses. Obviously, these were a lot of students who had been living on campus or near campus. I really liked Michael Williams. You said a forced disconnection. That's what we saw in the comments, a forced disconnection. Dianne and I, for our study and our chapter, wrote about and analyzed comments from almost 100 students that were the more lengthy comments. And we used Macmillan and Chavez's theory of community to kind of structure what we were seeing in the comments. And so what you'll see in the chapter, if you look at it, is a lot of comments around group membership and boundaries and identities and language and symbols, things around influence or lack of influence now that they were at home. I was fascinated to hear that students no longer felt like they had influence in the classroom, because Zoom meetings don't work for them very well, or at least initially did not. They talked about losing the belonging in the community that helped reinforce them, their behaviors, their involvement, and they talked about a loss of emotional connections. So my 3 takeaways, and Dianne, you can do yours if you want. One was the huge sense of loss. I don't know about Dianne, I cried reading some of these, a huge sense of loss of all kinds of things, their groups, their supports, yeah, it was amazing. I was also struck by all the signs or things that they talked about belonging, even though they didn't use the word. So yes, it was connections and interactions, informal, not informal, places that signaled belonging to them, traditions that they missed out on that signaled belonging. And for me, my final sort of, I guess, takeaway was the value of all that in-person stuff, and that we just didn't feel it for months, let alone years. Dianne?
I agree with everything that you said, Sherry. I think the 2 big takeaways were the social and the academic places where they felt they belonged. And I think even as a faculty member, what struck me was the connection to faculty that they listed as they missed that piece. And just being able to go and talk to an instructor after class, or to go to an office hour. Those were things that they were missing because they didn't get feedback in a timely manner. So that was a big thing that I just sort of walked away with. And the other part was that feeling of being a part of something. And so much of online learning has been looked at from the lens of those who choose to be in online learning. What we found was that it's different if you don't choose it. And if people are fearful that that's going to be the new sort of mode of delivery of education, I think this survey alone could be used as evidence that in-person learning still needs to happen. And I think we need to think differently about how we create sense of belonging in virtual and in in-person spaces.
Anything else, Sherry or Tim or Diane? So we're going to transition to questions. We have a couple of questions in the chat we haven't addressed yet. And if you have some others, please let us know. But a question for all the panelists. So thinking about particularly PWIs, how does having a multicultural affairs center or office or DEI or intercultural offices on campus impact sense of belonging? Either from what we know or kind of transposing or extrapolating from what we know. I'll let anybody jump in.
There's a lot of different directions you can go with that, to be honest. And so I think there is something powerful and symbolic about the fact that spaces exist. And so when something has the name of a student or the name of a group that somebody affiliates with on it, it is a sign that we care about the issues and that we want you to come to a place. But I think some of the disconnection happens if that place isn't run in a way that like actually cares about promoting belonging and connection. And so it's not enough to just have the center. It has to have staff that care and that understand how to connect with students, that are going to use their resources to help students, faculty, and staff join and build greater connections. And so I think part of my own influence in thinking about a lot of it is in the mentoring literature, we talk about like career and psychosocial support and how they're like these separate kind of ideas. I feel like there's a version of that when it comes to the development of like academic support spaces. So whether it's a multicultural center, whether it's a retention center, whether it's a writing center, each one of them, even though they have a specific name that's related to the need that they're attempting to fulfill, there are some really important commonalities about the ways that they need to operate, because they need to be spaces that are continually inviting and figuring out new ways to invite people to participate in that community so that students can get the best of what they have to offer. And so I think it's not just having it, it also has to be in how you execute it, how you go about it, how you assess it and evaluate it to ensure that you're making progress from year to year, that you're reaching broader constituencies of people, and that you're paying close attention to the opportunity to meet new needs as your students evolve and as they change.
Go ahead, Annemarie.
Jump in. Thanks for that, Michael. That's such a great, so many great points in that. I'm going to turn to the students who shared their stories with us in our studies, and women of color in the chapter we talk about. They said, you know, the universities says that we have a multicultural center and they do all this DEI talk, but if they're not walking it, like we could see it, it's not transparent. And so if the university kind of positions all that narrative as if we're this kind of DEI focused institution, and look at this great, beautiful center that we have that's historic, and the rest of the university doesn't walk the talk, it made them feel like they didn't belong, and many of them felt like they got duped, right? So a lot of the literature that they were sent as they were prospective students didn't really match the experience they had on campus. And we had a really interesting difference from what Michael just said with the LGBT students. So a lot of the LGBTQ students who participated in our particular study said, I actually have never been to the Gender and Sexuality Center or the LGBTQ Center on campus, but it matters to me that we have one, because not all institutions have one. And the fact that this institution supports queer people structurally matters to me, even if I never go. So that was really interesting for us to learn, that their belonging was fostered just by having the structural space and knowing it was there, even if they didn't use it. So that's all I wanted to add.
And then there was something in one of the chapters, and I think it actually might have referenced Terrell's earlier work, where some of those centers can actually be exclusionary for students who hold multiple identities. And so where the center may be salient for one of their identities, but because of their intersectionality of their multiple social identities and minoritized social identities, they didn't necessarily felt like they belonged. And so it really is this complex construct that really varies a lot. We do actually have a chapter that addresses intersectionality very specifically. Michael's chapter gets into it as well, but that's really one of the key takeaways that Erin and I had as we read through all the chapters, that even though there's specific chapters on different student populations, this intersectionality of social identities really has an impact. And I think the other element is this, a lot of it's contextual, either in terms of how those centers are run, how the institution is run. We didn't get specifically into community colleges. We didn't get specifically into online learning, although there's a subchapter around the use of pedagogy and sense of belonging. And so there are a lot of other contextual issues, which, as I've been noting in the chat, probably is for the second edition of this book, because there's a lot of other contexts that really are important. So we had another question here, and this is to everybody. Do you have any examples or ideas, or have you heard of innovative things campuses are doing to increase sense of belonging in the virtual setting, now that we've been in the virtual setting for most of the last 2 years? As I mentioned, we have that one subchapter that addresses how to do that with pedagogy. But do our panelists, are they familiar with anything else? Maybe not. My guess is there are some innovative things out there. We just have not captured them yet.
Yeah, we have a couple of case studies in the book. So there's a few applicable takeaways there, but we don't have anything in particular or specific chapter on virtual environments and innovative ways to manage that.
Okay. So I see another question in the chat. So in my doctoral study, I'm focusing on the inclusivity and professional development of contingent faculty, so adjunct faculty, and their sense of belonging within their institution. I'm wondering how this parallel process could manifest within teacher-student relationships, consequently influencing student sense of belonging. Was there any evidence in the research that shows a correlation between the two, faculty sense of belonging and student sense of belonging? Now, I'm not familiar with any research, but do any of the panelists have any thoughts on that? My guess is that if the faculty don't feel like they belong, then probably they might pass that on to students. Michael, go ahead.
Yeah. The word correlation took me back a little bit, just because that suggests kind of a more quantitative approach to it, and I'm sure that needs to be done, and probably there's some places where you could do that. So I know like the NESE, for example, has the faculty survey, and you can do some complementary stuff there, and it's a direction for some future research. I can say that in some of my own recent work qualitatively, we've certainly seen that connection. And so doing some work right now with my research team, studying equity and diversity peer education programs. And part of what you're seeing is that the people who are in charge of running those programs find it difficult to navigate some of the contradictions that they feel for themselves. So if they're working at an institution or they're working in a space where they don't feel seen, they don't feel like they belong, they don't feel like they're supported, they don't feel like they're included in important decision-making at the institutional level, then it's hard for them to do that translational work where they're trying to make the students feel like they belong in the space. So how am I supposed to make you feel like you belong if I don't feel like I belong? And so like that thread is one that we're kind of pulling on right now, but it arose like I would say by accident. I wasn't asking specific questions in the interview protocol about like perceptions of belonging and how it connects to supporting students. But I would suspect that quantitative work would back it up, and that I think there's like kind of a really interesting practical connection between those things. Why would you invite somebody to belong? Why would you support somebody belonging in a place where you don't really believe in what's going on, or how some of the major problems are being approached?
Thanks, Michael. And then Terrell dropped an item in the chat as well. Do you want to follow up on that, Terrell, and expand on that in terms of some of your research?
Sure. So echoing the sentiments of Michael, but it also connects back to the previous question around centers. I mean, sense of belonging is an affective sort of construct. Is it a feeling? And it's got certain thought patterns and processes attached to it. And so because it is our response to climate, conditions, relationships, incidents, we, students is what we're talking about, but in this case, faculty, we're always looking for cues that will signal to us, I belong or I don't. And so for a student who's on a campus, whether it's predominantly white or historically Black, you know, the presence of a cultural center or an LGBTQIA center affirms for that student in the moment, hey, the institution is thinking about people like me, right? And the other piece of this is we're often looking to institutional agents, people who are attached to the institution, like faculty and staff. And when they look like us, think like us, share our research interests or our teaching interests, you know, say hello in the hallway. The message that students make of that is, I matter, I belong. I'm more than a name on a roster. And so they don't, you know, and this also connects back with so much of what we know about students. Students don't, you know, they're not on a rainy day walking in the hallway and some faculty or staff member says, hey, good to see you again. Can't wait to see you in class on Wednesday. They don't say, oh, that's a part-time teacher. That's a part-time adjunct. That's not a full-time. I don't, you know, they don't privilege us in that way that we sometimes do in the academy. They look at it as a message that someone knows me, recognizes me, remembers that I'm in class with them on Wednesday. I'll close by saying some of the points that many other panelists have made. You know, that's great and good news when it's done well, but it is also problematic when the person says hello, see you in class on Wednesday, and you're not that Native American student who's in that class on Wednesday, but you know the one who's there that you just got confused by. And so then the message that you're left with, you're just sitting in the hallway and left with this message of, what does it mean? That we all look alike, that I don't matter, that they don't really know me. So we have to be very careful that while there's a lot of positive and potent pieces to belonging and its mechanics, there's some challenges that it also presents when done wrong.
Great, thanks, Terrell. So we have another question about, which I think is an excellent one. How do we train student leaders, such as peer mentors, RAs, orientation leaders, to help foster this sense of belonging? Love to hear ideas from panelists.
This is less of a, I guess, hard advice and more of a sentiment or a framework with which to approach these conversations. We've discussed a little bit how sense of belonging is it's really hard fought, right? It's a difficult thing to develop. It develops over time, and it's not just something that kind of falls out of the sky to students. We hope that they feel like they belong, but I like to frame sense of belonging as almost like an arc, and arc's not even fair because it's going to spike up and down, and you hope the trend is upward over time. And so articulating to student leaders and to peer mentors that the sense of belonging is not all warm and fuzzies, and that it's a difficult thing to figure out, and also that it's not only up to students. We don't want to place the onus of responsibility on students themselves to figure this out. It's an institutional imperative. It's up to us, as Terrell has mentioned. So it's all of that. If you can put that in a teaching seminar to student leaders, I think that would be great.
Great. Other thoughts?
I also think it's really important for student leaders to understand how complex this is, and that just because you feel a sense of belonging or don't feel a sense of belonging or somewhere in between, based on your own particular identities and experiences, doesn't mean that that's what the students in front of you are going to want and need and their experience. And so just making sure that they don't come off with really easy answers like, well, join a Greek organization or go to the multicultural center or take this major, like that's what worked for me. And to really get, we hear a lot of, you know, student leaders only know their experience sometimes, but to help them really foster kind of the diverse ways you can foster sense of belonging in students.
Right.
Yeah, I would add there, I think one of the most important things to remember about sense of belonging when you're training and interacting with student leaders is to remind them that it's context specific, and that a student may have pockets and places where they really feel like they belong. It could be the residence hall, it could be the library, it could be a sports team, it could be an extracurricular, but that doesn't necessarily translate to all the different domains of interaction that they have to navigate while they're on campus. And so I think a broader, kind of more global understanding of the fact that, like, yeah, you can help somebody feel like they belong in some spaces. You can't necessarily solve all the problems, and that's not really your job. Part of your job has to be, and to kind of connect to what Dr. Strayhorn was talking about, are you in the network of people that can give them those positive cues and act on it in a meaningful way? Like, if you're cueing to your students that you belong because you're an RA and you see them in the residence hall and you smile and wave, are you available when they are in crisis, right? Like, they're very easy connections. Similarly, if you're somebody and I have an international student that I'm working with right now who I finally walked over to the writing center, and the effort of walking them to the writing center made them feel like they belong there. And now they're like, oh man, this is my 3rd year here. I should have been coming here the whole time, right? Like, what are the linkages? What are the ways that we're showing people that things are available to them and that it's okay for them to take advantage of it? I think that that's a part of it too. And then I would also just kind of think about, I think one of the emergent ideas that we're working with right now is this idea of like trauma-informed approaches to care. And I think it has a lot to do, as we think about students' sense of belonging, if we're asking that new guiding question, not like what's wrong with you, but what happened to you, understanding a little bit more about students' history, like teaching our paraprofessionals and our students that we're working with to mine and figure out like, oh, maybe there's a trigger, maybe there's something in an educational experience that doesn't let them take advantage of the way that we want. We have to learn about the students that we're serving so that we can appropriately individualize our approaches to supporting them.
Great. Thanks, Michael. And somebody had asked earlier in the Q&A, is this appropriate for students? You know, one of our key audiences was graduate students and professional preparation programs, but I think this could be a great book, at least some of the chapters, for those student leaders to really understand some of that foundational pieces. As Annemarie said, you know, just simply telling students to get involved, it may not be enough. It could be enough for some students, but it's more complex than that. Sorry we weren't able to get to all the questions. I'm going to pass it over to Erin for a quick wrap up, and then we'll have David from Stylus conclude us.
All right, a very quick wrap up. Okay, so what I do want to say is we know, I mean, as early as Maslow's work in 1943, that sense of belonging has been documented as a powerful drive for success and fulfillment. We've talked about that student success is complex, multidimensional, and historical approaches are not working. So here's what I would say. Our institutions must play an active role in creating an environment for student success. And this is a paradigm shift from the deficit model from which universities operate. Systemic policies and practices and logistics that prohibit students from experiencing belonging on campus should be identified and discarded. You know, again, universities need to take an active role in this. One other thing we touched on that we also saw, as Michael talked about, some things that were happening nationally. Colleges and universities don't exist in a bubble. How our institutions respond to local and national events impact whether students feel like they belong or not. It sends a message. And lastly, what I would say before turning it to Gavin is identity is at the heart of belonging.
David, do you want to wrap us up?
Sure. So thank you for all of our chapter authors and editors for sharing their time with us today. And thank you for everyone who tuned in live on Zoom here. Folks, I have posted in the chat information about the discount for pre-ordering this book, as well as information about accessing the recording. In the thank you message you get after this event, you will get what am I trying to say? The chat will be included in that, so you'll have access to that as well. I'm going fast because we're past the hour. So if folks, start to need to leave to get on to their other thing, I just wanted to be sure that everybody knew that. I will keep this open for a little while so people can copy anything out of the chat, such as the link and the discount. And in fact, just for a while, there are still some folks here. I will share my screen and so that we can access that while I say again, more slowly this time, that if you're interested in pre-ordering The Impact of Sense of Belonging in College, use code BELONG to get 30% off the book and free shipping from Stylus. The link is in the chat. The webinar video replay will be available on Monday and shared on all of our Stylus social media feeds. Registrants will also receive a follow-up email with all the links and downloads. Also, visit our Stylus webinar calendar to check on our upcoming spring webinar events. That's also posted in the chat. And if you have any feedback on this webinar or requests for future webinars, please feel free to email us directly at stylusinfo@styluspub.com. Well, thanks again and have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much again to our panelists. It was really a wonderful event. Thank you so much for your time today. And thanks to all the attendees for your participation.
Thank you for having us, David.
Thank you.
All right.